That, let's welcome Dr. Megan.
Hi, everyone. Welcome. I'm so glad that you chose to be here with me today. So I hope that you've come ready to do a little bit of work and reflection because that is my plan for us today. So if you are just joining us, I'm dropping some links in the chat. We're going to be referring to some worksheets. So that's the file number 0 there. And I'll keep dropping those links in the chat as we go through. So again, welcome. If you are here for self-awareness, for social justice, you're in the right place. I'm really glad again that you chose to be here. My name is Megan Pollock, and I am based out of Dallas, Texas. And I am the founder and chief inclusion engineer for my company called Engineer Inclusion. And we help organizations and people intentionally and systematically engineer equity and inclusion into their organization, driving those positive outcomes while also supporting their people and the community. And I come to this work because I'm an engineer. I worked in industry for Texas Instruments as an electrical engineer. And then back in 2009, decided to go back to school and work on my doctorate with a mission to transform engineering. And so I've spent the last decade or so really focused on professional development for people and organizational change. And so if you want to learn more about me, you can visit my website. So Mahima already introduced us to Zoom. I feel like at this point we are all Zoom experts, but just in case, we have activated the live transcript option. So if you need enhanced accessibility, make sure that you activate that. Again, while you all are muted, this is a conversation. And so please don't hesitate to ask questions, to unmute your mic and tune in, chime in. I'm going to keep an eye on the chat, but in case I miss something, be sure to pop it back in there or just unmute and tell me what's on your mind. So I would encourage you to liberally use the chat. It helps us to communicate and to encourage more discussion and connection. You can also use the reactions, and again, it's just a way to stay engaged. We're not going to use breakout rooms or annotation today, and you can change your name to reflect how you want me to call you. So if you want to add your pronouns, then I encourage you to do that as well. And again, all else fails, any issues, your best bet is to log off, reboot, reset, and then come back in, and then you'll be set. So again, as I've mentioned, there's a packet for you to download, and I'll keep again dropping that in the chat. It looks like this. So if you don't have time to print it, it's okay. It's a form, so you'll be able to work within the worksheet right from your computer. If you have an iPad, you can import it into your favorite note-taking app and then use your stylus. But there are a variety of ways you can access that. So I would love to know who's here. So drop your name in the chat, your role, your institution, organization, and why you and where, because we're all over the world today, and tell us why you chose to be here. And so while everyone's taking the opportunity to introduce themselves, and feel free to drop your LinkedIn profile in the chat, because it would be great to connect with one another that way as well. While you're doing that, I'm going to move us forward and sort of set the pace for our time together. So just like the abstract outlined, we've got 3 parts to our workshop today. The first part is we're just going to really kind of touch on social justice and spend a minute defining those terms and what it means to us and what it means to the world. And then the second part is we're going to focus on what is inclusive leadership. And so I'll talk about one of my frameworks for that and how we can think about how we can improve our own practice as inclusive leaders. And the third part that really marries the two is this big self-awareness piece. Hi, Betsy. Thanks for introducing yourself. Hi, Robin. Excited that you both have joined us. Again, welcome everyone else to continue dropping their information into the chat. So we're going to again start the conversation with social justice. Now, again, as I promised, I want this to be interactive. And so I want you to take a minute and reflect. What does social justice mean to you? And if you have the handouts, there's space for you to take note there. And so again, just take a minute and reflect. What does social justice mean to you? If you've got an idea you want to share, you're welcome to drop that in the chat. Hi, Heather. Hi, Caitlin. Hi, Carrie. Thanks for joining us. Deanna, my aunt worked at Sandia National Labs for 30 years. as an engineer there. She has since retired, but she's still in Albuquerque. Glad that you're here. Side note, when I was in 5th grade, I went to take, your sons and daughters to work day at Sandia. I'm just her niece, but it was very remarkable. So Heather, you're from Los Alamos. You're the rival national lab. Well, glad that we've got some rivalry here, but hopefully today we can all come together. So again, I wanted to get your neurons firing to think about what does social justice mean to you. And so let's look at some terms here. Let's break it down to the root, and let's start with the word just. What does the word just mean? And so just by definition, it is acting or being in conformity with what is morally right or good. It is being what is merited. And so certainly when we think about terms like what is morally right or good, there's a lot of room for, opinion there. And so there are different values and ways of knowing and doing and how that's perceived. But then the second sort of piece of what justness is what's legally correct, right? So this introduces sort of the notion of a system, which leads us to the definition of justice. So again, 2 definitions here. And justice, it's the quality of being just, impartial, fair. But then again, the second piece of this is really the administration of law, and it's that system of justice that drives those sort of mores and laws and ways of knowing and doing. And when we press this further to think of social justice, what it is, social justice, it's how fairness manifests in our society. And it depends on 4 fundamental goals, and we're going to look at those here in a second. But lack of these items can be barriers in the workplace, and they can limit the experiences of marginalized and minoritized individuals to reach their potential. And so again, by definition, social justice is that state or doctrine of egalitarianism. And if you're like, what is that? So what that is it's a belief in human equality. And I want to believe that that's something that we all truly believe, right? There may be some philosophical differences, and certainly the term social justice has become, unfortunately, oddly polarized in the way that we are living in this world right now. But the heart of it, it's just the belief that humans have equality, right? And when it comes to respect to their social, political, economic affairs. And then the sort of action piece to this, so there's the belief and there's the action, it's the philosophy of advocating for the removal of those inequalities among people. And as I sort of suggested, there are 4 goals to this. And what those 4 goals are human rights, access, participation, and equity. And so what we're going to do here in a second is I'm going to play a short video. It's like 3 minutes long, but it explains what the difference is between equity and equality. And so what I'd like to invite you to do, again, if you have downloaded the worksheets, there's some space here for you to reflect on each of these 4 components as you watch the video. So again, I want you to keep these 4 things in mind: human rights, access, participation, and equity, as we're watching this really brief video that helps us to understand what is the difference between equity and equality. All right. As I push play, if for whatever reason you can't hear it, put something in the chat and let me know that there's some issues, okay? Can you hear it? What is the difference between equality and equity? Equality is when everyone gets the same. For example, everyone should have the same rights and access to opportunity. However, our systems, institutions, laws, and policies weren't built with true equality in mind. So equality isn't reality. Federal legislations have attempted to right these inequalities, but legislation alone cannot repair a complex system. The lasting impact creates systemic inequities in access and opportunity. As a result, marginalized groups face even more challenges, and dominant groups receive an unearned advantage or privilege. Equity compensates for systemic inequalities. It is an effort to give everyone what they need to succeed. Equity is an explicit effort to level the playing field with the goal of reaching equality. So equality is the goal, and equity is how we get there. Are you an equity builder? You can bridge the gap and lift others up. By activating equity in our pursuit of equality, we can create a more inclusive and just world. All right, so now that you've watched this really brief video explaining the difference between equality and equity, I want you to make sure that you take a minute to really think about how does that make us understand these four fundamental goals of social justice. So certainly throughout that, we understand the access of human rights, like the importance of human rights and the inequality that exists, and it's embedded and it's ingrained in the structure of our country, of our law system, of our justice system, of our organizations, whether no matter what kind of organization you're at, whether you're at one of the federal national labs, or if you're at a company or in a higher ed institution, all of these inequities are built into those systems. And certainly as women within the field of engineering, we know a lot about access and participation within engineering and the lack of participation of women and people of color within these pathways. And that is a true social justice issue, right? Like, because access and participation are critical to, number one, certainly increasing the diversity of our teams, but really it can become it's a tremendous moral issue when we think about the fact that most of the highest paying jobs in the US and certainly across the globe are within engineering disciplines, and yet so many women and people of color don't have equitable access and a persistent participation within those fields because of the climate and culture. And so again, when we think about the sort of social justice issue here, that's really what's framing our conversation. And so we're going to talk today about inclusive leadership and the social awareness components of this, and it's going to tie all of this back together for us. So let's now look at inclusive leadership. So inclusive leadership, there is a framework from Bork and Espedito and on why inclusive leaders are good for organizations. And there was an original study to this, but this is the study that I'm referencing, or the article I'm referencing. And there are, again, 6 traits or behaviors that distinguish inclusive leaders from one another. And the first is a visible commitment. And so again, I want to push you back to the handouts here, because if you go to the handouts, what I'd like to invite you to do is, as I'm going over these, take some notes and reflect on your own experience and kind of see where do you fall in relation to each of these inclusive leadership traits. So for those of you who just joined us, I'm sharing some links in the chat. Right now I'm referencing the worksheets if you want to access that. So again, visible commitment. So what that is a visible commitment is when a leader articulates a true, authentic commitment to diversity. They challenge the status quo, they hold others accountable, and they make diversity and inclusion a personal priority. And so this is number one, right? Again, it's that visible commitment that you are clearly stating that you care about and are striving towards improving equity, access, and diversity. You can't be an inclusive leader without that visible commitment. The second is they are humble. And what this means is they are modest about their capabilities, they admit mistakes, and they create space for others to contribute. So micromanagers need not apply here, right? Because we want to create space for other people to contribute. And what's really critical here is that we are taking the opportunity to admit mistakes and be accountable for our actions. Inclusive leaders take responsibility for when we have those human moments and our bias bubbles up in our conversation. To practice again that humility, it's to again create space for others to be successful, and to always admit those mistakes. That's really, really important. The third is awareness of bias. And this is certainly one of the things that gets the most press when it comes to this work. And our awareness of bias is really an ongoing effort of increasing our visibility of those blind spots that we all have. as well as not only within ourselves, but those flaws within the systems that we function, and understanding the ways that we may be unintentionally upholding those systems of oppression that are marginalizing and continuing to minoritize other individuals. And so again, this is an ongoing effort. Like, you're never done. You're never at a point where you can just check it off and be like, I'm good. I got no more bias, because that's impossible. If you have a brain, you have bias. And one of the resources in the packet and in the set of links there, the file number 3 is a self-paced webinar with resources on really understanding how do prejudice and stereotypes work in your brain, and then how they then manifest as implicit biases. And so if you dig neuroscience at all, that's really goes a little deep into neuroscience, because you're really understanding the actual neural networks in your brain. But it's again 100% proof that's talking about, if you have a brain, you have bias. But yet that webinar is linked explicitly to strategies related to each of those, because we can use self-regulation to mitigate the ways that our bias, prejudice, and stereotypes manifest in our interactions. The fourth one is a curiosity for others. And so inclusive leaders, they demonstrate an open mindset, and again, that deep curiosity about others. They listen without judgment and with empathy, and they seek to understand those around them. So key words here to me are empathy, leading with empathy, and listening without judgment, right? And keyword meaning listen. It's hard to listen without judgment if you're not truly listening. And this is one of those professional life skills that we don't really learn. And there are skills to being a good listener. And practicing that curiosity and understanding other people is really key. The fifth one is cultural intelligence. So inclusive leaders are attentive to others' cultures, and they adapt as required. One of the key things here is understanding that there are different ways of knowing and doing, and that if you are like me and maybe white and from the dominant culture, we may operate in such ways that are so centered in our lived experience of ways of knowing and doing, that we don't realize the ways that we are disenfranchising and marginalizing other people who do things differently, right? Like different cultural ways of knowing and doing. And so cultural attentiveness, cultural intelligence is really being attentive to that and being more inclusive in our strategies for how we meet, how we work, how we, if you're in education, how you're grading students, how you're bringing your teams together, and who you're honoring and in what ways. And then the sixth trait or behavior that distinguish inclusive leaders from others is effective collaboration. And so in this case, they empower others, they pay attention to the diversity of thinking and the psychological safety, and really focus on team cohesion. And so this really goes back to all of the others, right? To be an effective collaborator, to truly be an effective collaborator, we have to have that humility, that awareness of bias, that curiosity, and that cultural intelligence. And so again, all of these work together. Now, I want to introduce my company's framework, and this is in publication. It's not out yet. It's going to be a book chapter coming out this year. And so for the inclusive leadership development model, there are 4 components: individual, lens, practice, and outcomes. And so even though this graphic may look linear, it's really an iterative, never-ending process of human development. So let's look at the first one. So specifically the individual. So how to be an inclusive leader is, first, we have to understand the self, right? Who we are, including all of our identities, our lived experiences, our life exposure, our realities, our truths, our traumas, our thoughts. All of these things influence how we perceive everything in the world. All of these things become a lens through which everything is filtered. And to be equitable and inclusive leaders, we must understand how our identities bias our perceptions. So recognizing the power of the personal lens means understanding our positionality. And that's the social and political context that creates your identity, and how your identity influences and biases your perception of an outlook of the world. And there's a link in the handout, as well as in the chat, on how to understand what is your positionality. And so positionality, it affects our research, teaching, leading, policymaking, as well as our just common interactions. And so the first two components are deeply intertwined. So our individual and our lens. So learning our positionality requires us to consider privilege, and you can't fully consider privilege systems of advantage without also learning about systems of oppression. So the second key component is how we develop a diversity, equity, and inclusion lens. And so while this is labeled a lens, it's more accurately a way of thinking or a way of looking at the world. And there isn't a magical lens that we can pick up to instantly have Superman's X-ray vision into the systems around us. So developing a DEI, diversity, equity, and inclusion lens, it's a process of honing knowledge, expanding awareness, and making adjustments to alter our perspectives. Was there a question? Okay, if you got a question, feel free to chime back in. I heard a mic unlock. Okay, so an inclusive leader's lens allows them to do the following. One, see and consider how systems of oppression and advantage influence their decisions and impact their team. Two, to examine intersectionality. And what that is the interconnected nature of social categorizations that can create overlapping and interdependent systems of discrimination or advantage. And then three, to investigate the ways in which bias, both interpersonal and institutionalized, become an ethical dilemma that must be addressed. And the third sort of piece here is establishing DEI, diversity, equity, and inclusion practices. And there are two key practices inclusive leaders must develop. So the first practice is a human-centered approach, and it's a spin on the philosophy of design and design thinking popularized by Stanford's D School. And so Richard Buchanan, I love this quote, he describes it as follows: human-centered design is fundamentally an affirmation of human dignity. It is an ongoing search for what can be done to support and strengthen the dignity of human beings as they act out their lives in varied social, economic, political, and cultural circumstances. And so just like the Stanford model leads with empathy, we must also intentionally lead with empathy, curiosity, and open-mindedness, aim to strengthen the dignity of all humans around us. So the second practice to becoming an accountable lifelong learner. And so again, this is tied to one of the things I mentioned before. And so the journey to becoming an equitable and inclusive leader is never done. It is fraught with mistakes and failures. And inclusive leaders are optimistic about the possibilities and opportunities to improve equity, access, and diversity, deeply reflective of personal and institutional actions, committed to seeking information to learn more about what they don't know, and finally, personally accountable to mistakes, failures, and mishaps. And what this means is like you aren't deflecting, avoiding responsibility, and claiming good intent. And this happens so often, I see in this work, is that people who are perhaps new to their journey as becoming an equitable and inclusive practitioner is that we can get defensive, right? Like, but I'm doing so much and I didn't mean it. And generally that doesn't serve the feedback that we're giving, right? The best response is, wow, thank you for that feedback. I'm going to do better, right? It's not the right answer isn't to say, yeah, but that's not what I meant, right? Like we want to hear people, acknowledge them, and say, I'm going to do better, and mean it, right? And then the fourth key thing here are the desired outcomes. So when all of these elements are effectively incorporated into our ways of knowing and doing, we can expect two key outcomes. One, culturally intelligent communication, and two, inclusive collaboration. So both of these require a reflective practice and to continuously revise our lens and improve our practices. And in a global society, if we aren't culturally intelligent communicators, then we aren't good communicators. Let me say that again. If we aren't culturally intelligent my words aren't coming out. If we aren't culturally intelligent communicators in this global society, then we aren't good communicators, because good communicators are culturally intelligent because they can communicate in ways that reach every person. And so the same if then can be applied to inclusive collaboration. By claiming that we are good without the skills related to the adjectives of inclusive and culturally intelligent, we implicitly prioritize the dominant cultures. So in engineering, those are white, male, heterosexual, and Christian. And then the hidden curricula, which is what's not said and not presented, in that belief or in that teaching strategy is that any other culture or marginalized population isn't important. So again, what's key here is the explicit intentional effort towards these things. And so inclusive leaders are attentive to those whose voices and ways of knowing and doing are present and whose are either missing or being silenced. And they actively work towards both diversity and inclusion. And so again, this is a way of looking at how do I become an inclusive leader, inclusive educator, inclusive person. It's a journey, it's iterative, it's never done. But these are, again, the key components when we look at the literature that helps us understand what we need to put into practice. I do want to make sure I give a definition because I've said it a few times, but I want to define what is a system of oppression, because for many of us, this might be a new term. You may have heard it on the news because it has been in the news more in the last year than it ever has before. But if you don't know what it is, a system of oppression, systems of oppression enable dominant groups to exert control over non-dominant groups by limiting their rights, freedom, and access to basic resources such as healthcare, education, employment, and housing. So this is a system of disadvantage. There are also systems of advantage, which are privileges, right? And one way that you can look at this is through the 4I framework. And so again, a little bit outside the scope of what we can accomplish today, but I do have a recorded webinar that you can watch to learn about systems of oppression and colorblind racism. And again, that is link number 6 in the chat. So again, link number 6 in the chat. So what I want you to do now is to follow along in your worksheet packet as we step forward into talking about self-awareness. All right. Any questions before I move on to this third and connecting piece of self-awareness? What questions do you have? I know you may be conferenced out on day 1, but I would love to see your faces. If you all want to share cameras and join me in this communal space, that would be wonderful. Any questions? Okay. Hi, Holly. Thanks for sharing your camera. Yay, Mary. I should have asked sooner. Hi, Betsy. Thanks so much. Love it. Okay. So any questions before I move on? All right. So I want to give you another reflection question before we really dig into self-awareness. And so my question to you is, on a scale of 1 to 10, how self-aware do you think you are? On a scale of 1 to 10, how self-aware do you think you are? And so you can, again, we're going to be working in our packet here. We're moving on to this third section on self-awareness, and that is on page 6 in the packet. And so when you're thinking about how self-aware you are, you could think about a variety of dimensions. Here are a few things: relationships, communication, expertise, your open-mindedness, kindness, health, feedback, your leadership skills. On a scale of 1 to 10, think about how self-aware do you think you are? So let's look at definitions. It's always a good place to start. So self-awareness, by definition, is a conscious knowledge of one's own character, feelings, motives, and desires. And research tells us that when we see ourselves clearly, when we are self-aware, that we are more confident and creative, we make sounder decisions, we build stronger relationships and communicate more effectively. We're less likely to lie, cheat, and steal. We are better workers who get more promotions, and we're more effective leaders with more satisfied employees and more profitable companies. These are all great things, right? All of these things are really great outcomes for us. So let's look a little bit at self-awareness. And one of the book that I'm drawing from here is called Insight by Dr. Tasha Eurich. And I love this book. I listen to it once a year. I've taken a course with her. I am always trying to improve my self-awareness, and I assure you, I am not as self-aware as I probably think I am. So in this book, so her team of researchers embarked on a large-scale scientific study of self-awareness. So they had 10 separate investigations with nearly 5,000 participants across those investigations, and they examined what self-awareness is, why we need it, and how we can increase it. And so their research revealed some roadblocks, some myths, and truths about what self-awareness is and what it takes to improve it. And so there are three angles that I'm going to approach this conversation. So in the book, she talks about there are two types of self-awareness: that experience and power hinder self-awareness, and that introspection doesn't always improve self-awareness. So to start off, when we look at, so here's one of the key facts from the book, is that even though she quotes, even though most people believe they are self-aware, only 10 to 15% of the people they studied actually fit the criteria of someone who is self-aware. So it is a truly rare quality, so it seems. And so when we look at the two types of self-awareness, there's internal self-awareness and external self-awareness. So again, if you've got your packet open, you can take notes on page 6. What I want you to think about as I'm talking through each of these 2 points is, how self-aware do you think you are when it comes to an internal self-awareness and an external self-awareness? So internal self-awareness it represents how clearly we see our own values, our passions, aspirations, our fit within our environment. I think particularly when it comes to marginalized, underrepresented people within engineering and STEM fields, this is a big piece of like, how well do we feel like we fit and how well do we feel like we belong? It also involves our reactions. So that's our thoughts, our feelings, behaviors, our strengths, our weaknesses, and our impact on others. So it's our internal self-awareness of how these things impact other people. And so they found that self-awareness is associated with higher job and relationship satisfaction, personal and social control, and happiness. And they found that it is negatively correlated to anxiety, stress, and depression. So again, the more internally self-aware you are, evidently, the less likely you are to experience anxiety, stress, and depression. Great news there. And so external self-awareness, this means understanding how people view us in terms of the same factors listed on the previous slide. And their research showed that people who know how others see them are more skilled at showing empathy and taking others' perspectives. And when we're talking about equity work and being inclusive leaders, these are really important skills: empathy and taking other perspectives. So the more externally self-aware we are, the greater opportunity that we have to practice those inclusive leadership skills and to be the inclusive leaders that we want to be. And so for leaders who see themselves as their employees do, their employees tend to have a better relationship with them, feel more satisfied with them, and see them as more effective in general. And if you read her Harvard Business Review article, or if you read the book, and it's linked in the chat and also from the handout, there's 4 sort of self-awareness archetypes. I don't have time to go over this whole framework today, but again, it's a really useful tool. It's a 2x2 map that maps internal self-awareness against external self-awareness, and it helps you kind of understand where you might fall on this matrix. So I recommend looking that up and examining that self-awareness archetypes. Are you an introspector, a seeker, an aware person, or a pleaser? And so the next key thing is that experience and power hinder self-awareness. So people do not always learn from experience. Can you believe it? And expertise does not help people root out false information, And seeing ourselves as highly experienced can keep us from doing our homework, seeking disconfirming evidence, and questioning our assumptions. So again, expertise does not necessarily help us if we don't see past that and the opportunities that we have to learn. And so they found that just as experience can lead to a false sense of confidence about our performance, it can also make us overconfident about our level of self-knowledge. And the more power a leader holds, the more likely they are to overestimate their skills and abilities. So again, really useful things to understanding self-awareness. So we've got some new people that have joined us. I'm going to drop the links in the chat again. I encourage you to access those. Right now we're working on through the worksheet handout file 0. So they found in their interviews that people who improved their external self-awareness did so by seeking out feedback from what they call loving critics. Those are people who have their best interests in mind and are willing to tell them the truth. And so this is really important. So we probably all receive feedback all the time from people who aren't loving critics, right? Like they don't have our best interests in mind. They may be willing to tell us the truth, but it could definitely be through a very biased lens. And, somebody told me in my life, like there's always an ounce of truth in every bit of criticism or feedback that you receive, and you just have to find that. But again, one of the key findings in their study is that if we want to increase our self-awareness, we need to surround ourselves with loving critics, people who like us, people who love us, and people who are willing to tell us the truth. And then the flip side of this is you have to be willing to hear it, right? And to take that feedback and do something with it. Again, when we go back to what it means to be an inclusive leader, you can't be defensive. You can't say, yeah, well, that's not what I meant. I was doing something else, right? Like you take it and you hear it and say, thank you for that feedback. I'm going to take that into consideration and see what I can do with it, right? So the next piece of this, one of the surprising findings that they had is that people who introspect are less self-aware and report worse job satisfaction and well-being. And so the key here is that the problem isn't with introspection, it's that most people are doing it wrong. And so what they really talk about, and I love the framing here, is that most people are asking why. Well, why did this happen? Why did I react this way? Or why am I doing this? Or why did the employee do this? Or you start with why, right? And that's what Simon Sinek says, right? In his great book, Start With Why. But when it comes to self-awareness, that's not the question that we want to lead with. We want to start with what. And so what she identifies in the book is that the problem with asking why, it isn't just how wrong we are, but it's how confident we are that we are right. So when we ask why, we're trying to find that solution. We're not helping ourselves to get insight into what can be different, right? And so why really goes to a sort of singular answer. And so to increase productive self-insight and to decrease unproductive rumination, we should ask what, not why. So what questions help us stay objective? They are future focused, and we are empowered to act then on those new insights. And so again, the key here is that self-awareness, it isn't one truth. It's a balance of two distinct, even competing viewpoints. But when we start asking what, not why, we have a more objective, future-focused view of understanding in that. So again, ask what, not why. So some takeaways from her book here is that, one, we want to focus on building both internal and external self-awareness. And so when it comes to how we function as leaders, and as, whether you are in a leadership role that comes with a big team, or if you are a leader that's leading volunteers, or you are just a leader in your community, like there's so many different ways to be a leader. And I argue that we're all leaders in some way in our lives, that we must make sure that we're building those internal and external self-awarenesses. The second takeaway that she offers is that we have to seek honest feedback from loving critics. And so we can't improve our blind spots if they remain blind spots. And so getting people to help us see opportunities for growth is really critical. And then the final thing is, again, to ask what, not why. So moving into the sort of last piece of this, I want to offer four yous. And we're going to talk a little bit about these. And in the packet, there are a variety of resources for you to explore. So some tools for learning, from some tools to help you do some further analysis, because again, this is a reflective journey, and it's not just about awareness, it's absolutely about action, but those two must go hand in hand in a deeply iterative process. And so again, if you want to take notes here, I encourage you to do that. And so I offer these sort of four yous, and I have to fully admit, the word unoccupy is not a word, but I needed something that just worked my little flow here. And so you still get the picture of what it is. So the first is unravel bias. The second is to unpack our privilege. The third is to unclasp our position, and the fourth is to unoccupy power. And we're gonna talk about what those mean. And the most energy I want to spend in inviting you to consider is really around position and power and what that means for us. So again, as I suggested earlier, bias is one of the most common things that's talked about in the sphere, even though it's still something that we all have to work on and understand. All of us are on a journey to unraveling the bias in our brain and to increasing that awareness and then changing our reactions. And so again, in the link and in the packet, there is a self-paced course that you can take. It's anchored around a webinar, and there are lots of handouts and resources that you can use to go through that. But the key takeaway of that training is that there are networks in the brain that support the self-regulation of cognitive control, reducing the expression of prejudice and stereotypes, or what we call implicit bias, right? These things are all filed in our brains, and when you understand how they're working in your brain, it helps me better understand the way in which I can regulate them to mitigate the ways that they show up. Doesn't mean I'm catching all of them by any means, but the more self-awareness I have to what my biases are, the more self-awareness I have to the prejudice and stereotypes that exist in my brain, the less and the more self-regulation I use, the less likely those things are to manifest in how I communicate and evaluate other people. There is a video that is linked in the resources. We're not going to watch it right now because I want to make sure we have some time for conversation here. But so if you're still curious what implicit bias is and you want to watch the 3 or 4 minute version, there's a video on my website on what is implicit bias, and then there's the longer webinar and course that you can take. You can also take an implicit association test if you've never done that. The whole point is to increase your awareness, because from awareness, we can then take action. And you can visit implicit.harvard.edu. That's link number 3 in the chat. And then another thing that you can do is to read Blind Spot. It's a really good book. It's called The Hidden Biases of Good People. So I recommend reading that. Again, the reality is we all have bias, and it's just learning what we can do about that. So privilege is a really key component to this work, because if we don't understand and unpack our privilege, to use Dr. Peggy McIntosh's framing, then if we don't understand the systems of advantage, then it's harder to see the systems of a disadvantage for those people around us, or even the systems of disadvantage that affected us in our own path, right? And so here's Dr. McIntosh here. I'm sort of a fangirl for her, but she wrote this really seminal article, and it's linked in the chat, link number 5. And it's a really short article, but and it's her reflection of unpacking what she calls the invisible knapsack of privilege. And it's got some great reflection questions on it. I encourage you to do that and to think about this, because again, it's so she writes in her work, she says, my work is not about blame, shame, guilt, or whether one is a nice person. It's about observing, realizing, thinking systematically and personally. It's about seeing privilege. So again, go back to the model of the lens, right? It's about understanding our lens, and it's about understanding and developing a new way of looking at the world. And so to go back to her quote, she says, it's about seeing privilege. It's the upside of oppression and discrimination. It is about unearned advantage, which can also be described as an exemption from discrimination. And so again, encourage you to read that resource if you haven't before. And just as a, key here to define the term privilege, if that's a new term for people. And so privilege, it's a special right, as Dr. McIntosh says, it's that unearned advantage, or it's some kind of immunity granted or available only to a particular person or group. Now, what privilege doesn't mean that you didn't work hard, right? It's not what that means. It doesn't mean that you don't deserve, some of the things that you've accomplished. Again, it's not what it means. It means that your race, that your gender, your some other intersection of your identity wasn't a barrier to you doing that, right? And so there are lots of different ways to understand how privilege can happen, and to think about the norms and the dominant groups within each of these. And so, when we look at race, so the norm is whiteness, and society is structured as such to benefit people with white skin. The next is gender. And so the dominant group here is certainly males. And what happens is that certainly within engineering, we face male dominant organizations. It decreases career opportunities, and then there becomes some like internalized oppression around body type, appearance, and certainly increased sexual violence that is experienced by women. Next is socioeconomic. And so what this means, it's financial stability, it's access to resources and opportunities. And again, it's like telling a fish that water is wet. You may not know that you live in a world of privilege if it's all that you know, right? And you assume that everyone has these experiences and benefits. Next is Christian, and that is again the dominant. It's a dominant group here within the U.S. And in many parts of the globe. And again, these norms are US centric. I can't speak for the whole world. Certainly in the US, heterosexual is a privileged group. They are able to marry and adopt. They're not viewed as others as deviant. Able-bodied, so your ability to physically participate in society. If you are not able-bodied, you face different roadblocks to being able to participate in things. Nationality, your access due to the country in which you live or to which you have a passport. Education. So this is something I learned really early on, that even though I was raised in a family that didn't have much money, somehow I learned that education could be my way to have greater access and opportunity in the world. And so, sometimes we take education for granted, but the fact that we have, I've had, and many of us have had such an increased access to higher education, that is a privilege. Again, doesn't mean you didn't work hard, doesn't mean you didn't earn those A's. It just means that you may not have faced the same kinds of barriers and roadblocks that others have faced. Again, the list goes on, right? We can look at whether you're right-handed. My little brother is left-handed, and it was like an alien was born into our family when he was born several years after I was. And because the world wasn't built for him, right? We think about geographic location, access to information resources. When we think about the challenges around education over the last year, we've certainly seen these privileges to access to different resources. English speaking is a privilege. Your birth order, your access to rights, your age, your body size, your gender identity, having access to modern utilities and family structure. All of these things have systems of advantage and disadvantage tied to them. And again, the key here is to think about, does your identity did it create roadblocks, or did it put you in a fast lane where you didn't have those roadblocks? That's the way that we want to look at this. Am I moving faster and not having struggles because I don't have the same roadblocks as my neighbor? Or, again, it's looking at those systems of advantage and systems of oppression. As I already teased earlier, positionality is a great exercise to do. It's, again, in the links, and it's also in the handout. And so I encourage you to do this. The positionality exercise, admittedly, is a pretty in-depth reflection. Let's see, I don't see it on that list. It is on the PDF. So if you go here on the last page, what is positionality? There's a link there. And so you can see the positionality exercise. I encourage you to do that. It's an in-depth reflection. It's a great thing to do with a trusted friend, maybe with one of your loving critics. And I encourage you to do that. The last two key points here is to unclasp our position and unoccupy power. And there are sort of three ways that we can sort of move through the world. We could be people who are unaware. Sometimes we don't know what we don't know, but at some point that's not a valid excuse, because we all can learn more and do better. The second kind of person is someone who is aware and they don't care. So they could be aware of their power, their privileged position, and they don't care about doing anything about it or about understanding the experiences of other people. And then the third one is that you are someone who is both aware and you care. And this is something that I have been working on over the last couple of years with greater intent. And it was really spurred by this sort of meme that came across my Facebook channel. And so I want to read it to you because it's something that was incredibly powerful to me. And so the quote says, "When people are woke enough to know the language to discuss race, gender, class, and oppression generally, but not quite woke enough to give anything up, space, power, platform, reputation, position, this is arguably the most destructive pattern of behavior of our time." And so if you're not familiar with what the word woke means, it's a woke person is someone who is aware of and actively attentive to important facts and issues, especially issues of racial and social justice. So the woke term means like you were asleep and then you were awake and then you now see these things, right? But if we remain able to talk about these things, but we don't do anything, right? If we don't take any action, if we don't do any change, if we don't become self-aware enough to be those inclusive leaders that we want to be, because that means sometimes stepping out of the limelight and pushing someone else forward. It means thinking about, where do I have power that I don't need to have power? Who do I need to, again, get out of the way for and push forward? People from marginalized communities and identities, they have voices, but we might be in a position where our voice is drowning theirs out. And so what is it that we're doing? How are we moving? How are we changing? And what are we enabling for other people who have historically been marginalized and minoritized to rise up and to let their voices truly be heard? And so again, if we want to practice what we preach as inclusive individuals and as inclusive leaders and educators, whatever field that you're in, we have to move past awareness and take action. So again, in wrapping up our session, I want to leave you with this quote from Janetta Sagan. And what's most often repeated is silence is complicity. But the full quote is that silence in the face of injustice is complicity with the oppressor. So if we are leaders and we aren't paying attention to the injustice that the people around us are facing, if we aren't doing something about it, we are complicit with their oppression. And I don't know about you, but I don't want that to be me. And so in order for me to not be silent in the face of injustice, to not be complicit, I have to increase my self-awareness, both internally and externally, to understand how and what ways do I need to increase my awareness around bias and discrimination and systems of oppression and privilege and stereotypes. What do I need to do? And then how do I make sure that the people who are around me are moving forward in a positive way? So we've got a few minutes. I want to make sure that we have some questions, room for questions. What's on your mind? So I'll give you a few minutes for questions, and then I'll end with another final thought. What's on your mind? Carrie, Cecilia, Deanna, Dina, Emily, Ebthahal, Hannah, Holly, Indu, Jenny, Jisha, Jordan, Kaylin and Kathuri, Lisa, Lonnie, Nayere, Nadikim, Nicola, Nani, Renata, Robin, Sarah, Sharina, Suman. Any questions? What's on your mind?
So how do we navigate, especially in these trying times, with all the Asian hatred and the African American hatred and the, how do you, what are your recommendations for A, becoming the change, and B, learning about how they feel in their, because we can't feel it for them. So we engage them somehow and discuss with them the difficulties they've had in their life, or how do we engage people that are being discriminated?
So the first thing that we can do is to, in tandem with, is to educate ourselves. And what that doesn't mean is to go ask your Asian friend or colleague to explain their lived experience to you. It's a really big burden to ask them to do when they're already facing trauma. But right now, there are so many beautiful stories and tragic stories that people have shared on podcasts, on news, on television shows. You can follow people on Twitter. Like, consume people's stories and listen and believe them when they tell you, right? Like, it's really easy for us to say, oh, that can't be true. Oh, that can't be right. But if someone's telling your story, we want to believe them. And so the first thing we can do is to go seek out the stories. In tandem with that is to speak up, right? To advocate for people who are facing, hate crimes, right? Like, if we see it, you got to say something, right? You want to engage in a way that helps that person feel supported, and not that, you're trying to rescue them, but you want to call out something if maybe they don't feel safe to be able to do that. And so certainly not encouraging that within the people within our workplaces, within our communities, is to speak out against those things. If we don't, we are then complicit in it. We're saying it's okay if we don't do something or say something. And that's a practice, right? Like, it takes a minute to build up some courage to do those things, but I implore you and all of us to build that courage, because while we might be uncomfortable, people are being traumatized, and then we can do something and say something. Thanks for sharing that link in the chat. Thanks for your question, Holly. So I encourage you to reach out to me if you have any questions. I've got tons of resources. I'd love to help you continue learning. I'll leave you with one of my new favorite quotes from this year, and it's from Amanda Gorman, and she is the poet laureate, and she read her poem during the inauguration, and she ended with these words. She said, "There is always light if we're only brave enough to see it, if we're only brave enough to be it." And so if we want to be inclusive leaders, we have to be brave enough to see that light, and we have to be brave enough to be it. So I'm so grateful that you've chosen to be here with me today, and thanks for sharing your time, your energy, and I wish you all the best as you move forward with this conference, and I'd love to stay in touch. So copy all the links I dropped in the chat, and I hope to hear from you. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Megan. It was a very thought-provoking session, and I'm sure it got me thinking, and I'm sure it had the same effect on all of you. Uh, I thank all the participants, all the audience who was tuned in, and also a reminder that this session has been recorded and will be made available on the Engage's virtual platform. And also, I hope you enjoy the rest of the conference. Thank you, Megan.
Thank you. Thanks, Jenny. Thanks, Kathuri. Thanks, Lisa. Thanks, Suman, Sharena. Thanks, Nani, Indu. Thanks, H. Stoiber at the hall. Thank you so much for coming.